Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mike Ward.
Hey there. So I'm excited to be with you. I'm excited that we can do this in this way during this time. And so I believe I'll be with you for about the next hour, and then I know there's a little bit more to the program after I finish, but I'm going to go and do kind of what I'm doing now with another synod. So I'm going from South Carolina to Southern Ohio from here, but excited to be with you. For those of you I don't know or don't know me, I was parish pastor in Charlotte for 4 years, and then went to be VP of Advancement at Lutheridge Luther Rock, now Novus Way, for about a dozen years. I've been consulting actually since about 2007 in a part-time basis, and then full-time for a while. Been working with Ozzy with some congregations down at the coast here recently on Stewardship for All Seasons. And we've done a little bit of that here and there across the Synod as well. But today we're gathered to talk about stewardship, and it looks like we have 28 people already, and it's almost Holy Week. And so I'm guessing there might be a little bit of anxiety around the topic of stewardship right now. And so I'm glad we can have this time together to have conversation. The way I'm planning on devoting our time is I'll spend about a half an hour ish on just sharing some ideas, stories, best practices that I have, and then I'd like to open it up to your questions, comments, and if you don't talk, we'll just sit here awkwardly in silence at that moment. So so that's kind of how I'd like to devote our time. In the chat box, I've put a link to my company's blog site. There's currently several articles. There's 3 videos that have been produced since the outbreak of COVID-19. One of which I'll reference now. The first one I did about 2.5 weeks ago. I had a council president email me after viewing it and told me that it was the first night he'd been able to sleep since the outbreak had begun. And not because it was such a boring video, it was because it gave him the confidence to know that we can get through this. So that's there. And then I'm going to talk a whole lot about communication today. And there's a video devoted solely to communication that is up on there as well. And then there's some other articles and things that we've written. You can check it out. If you like it, sign up for it. You'll get push notifications when we add more. If you don't like it, just ignore it and never show up again, and it'll be fine.
Can you tell us again where that's going to be?
So if you look in the chat box, if you scroll your cursor around the box a little bit, at the very bottom, a toolbar will appear, and one of those buttons should say chat. It should be flashing orange if it's not already.
Okay.
Click on that, and then the chat bar will open up on the side, and it's there.
Oh, so, great. Thank you.
Sure. Quick ground rule, though, on our time together is I'm going to talk about that without being muted. So I was brought in to talk about stewardship, and I'm going to stick with that topic. I'm going to stay in my lane. I'm not going to talk about how to do virtual worship, how to do pastoral care in these times, any of those things. I'm here to talk about stewardship. It's not that I don't care about the others. I just don't have anything to bring to the conversation that is worth you tuning in for on that, probably. So this is really a stewardship conversation. I want to start with just a couple of stories that there is a lot of abundance out there right now. You may not know that if you're spending too much time watching the news, and don't get me wrong, it's a serious situation. I'm not trying to downplay the situation by any means, but I am hearing, because of the circles I walk in, plenty of stories of generosity and abundance out there right now. A friend of mine's pastor in Southeast Michigan, in the Detroit area. He's been in Stewardship for All Seasons for a number of years. He said their offering Sunday, which was a fifth Sunday, was $9,000, which is $4,000 larger than they've ever had on a fifth Sunday before. Actually, his same congregation had 10 people sign up for automatic giving since the outbreak emerged. In addition to that, I know a pastor who is doubling their giving for the month of April, and has now been joined by many people in his congregation because of that witness of generosity. It's a story that says, yes, there's uncertainty out there. I don't know what tomorrow brings, but what I know I have now, I can double my giving for the month of I know a pastor who called their top 10 donors, which is something I'm going to talk about in a minute. 2 of those donors, without being asked, told her they were going to increase their giving because they were still doing fine and they knew there were people in their congregation that were hurting. Another pastor had a call in the morning one day and got $200 towards his pastor's discretionary fund. Later that afternoon, another member called and said, I'd like to give you $2,000 for your discretionary fund because I know there's people hurting out there. So all the stories, everybody hasn't lost everything. And we need to keep in mind there's plenty of generosity out there. The good news for church people, there's been 5 recessions since 1980. In every one of those recessions, giving has either maintained or increased to the church in those days, okay? We have no reason to believe this is going to be any different. The church is always the last to be cut if it does get cut by people. But what happens is people who can continue to give will give more, okay? The people who have capacity, when they see their neighbor in need, are willing to give a larger portion of their income away to take care of their neighbors. So that's a good thing. So what I want to do today is how do we position ourselves to do the best things we can to keep giving strong in our congregations and in our settings. And the number one thing we can do for that is good communication, all right? Whether you were in a crisis moment like today in our nation, or whether you're just doing day-to-day ministry, communication is always the best building block for stewardship. And our churches have modeled it not really great, necessarily. We like to tell people what we do. And we like to tell people what we do a lot to make us sound really busy, all right? That's been modeled to us for decades. I understand that the church of the 1970s loved that, and it worked great simply to tell people what we did. People flocked to it, they engaged it, they wanted to be part of it. That world has changed. Our communication now needs to be less about what we do and a lot more about why we do it. And during these times, that's even more important than it's ever been before. I call these impact stories or outcome stories. I'll go ahead and point you. I believe the ministry institution that does this best is the one I used to work at, Novus Way Ministries. Read their link newsletter. All it is outcome stories. All right. If you want to learn how to tell an outcome story, read the link newsletter from Novus Way. It's a model. Okay. So we need to be telling the impact and outcome. And I think it's actually easier to do that now. So this is a great time to engage this idea. Actually, it's a pastor in your synod. I can't see everybody. I'll throw them under the bus because it's a great story. Nathan Rice and I were talking, I think it was last week. I've lost track of time. March was the longest year I've ever lived through. I think you might have heard that too. But he was telling me that in the first comment, they did virtual worship the first time. And in the first comment went something like, I woke up this morning feeling the need to look for God, and I found your virtual worship service. And I found what I was looking for. Thank you very much. I'll be back again. Oh, it started with, I'm not a member of your congregation or any congregation. But I woke up with the need to find God, and I found your worship service. I found what I was looking for. Thank you. That's not an exact quote. You can talk to Nathan about what the exact quote was, but it was in that spirit. That's an outcome. The reason we put virtual worship on the web is so that somebody who wakes up needing to, feeling the need for God can find God. The outcome we were looking for was found. There's other outcomes being found. The musician at my congregation he and his daughter, I think she's in like 6th or 7th grade, they recorded Holden Evening Prayer, which is our typical Lenten Wednesday night service. And he sent it out with a recording, and I pushed play and I put it in the background and I kept working. And it was about halfway through that I almost broke down. I realized just how much I needed a little time with God in the midst of that. And I paused and I listened to it like 3 times in a row, and probably 3 or 4 times since, that I needed a moment for God, and my congregation provided that for me. So that's that's an outcome of my congregation being relevant for me in my life. My small group, we meet once a month. There's 4 couples of us from the church. Well, during this time, we've decided we're going to meet weekly, I'm sorry. And on Sunday night, we lingered for about an hour and 45 minutes doing just what we're doing now, caring for one another, listening to one another, making sure everything was as okay as it can be in the midst of what we're living in. Once again, that's my church being present in my life. That's an outcome of the whole reason we started small groups, whenever it is we started small groups, was so that today we can have a community that sustains us and supports us. That's the outcome of what we're doing. We need to tell those stories. We need to not keep those secret, because what people are looking for in your churches and what people are looking for to be generous to are the places that are making a difference in the world. And you are. And so we need to tell that and let people share those stories of faith. So where do you do that? I am confident that most all of you are pushing out a weekly newsletter, right? The first thing the lead in your weekly newsletter should be these outcome stories, these stories of impact, or at least one story of impact or outcome. If you put it anywhere further down in your news, you're doing what they call burying the lead. Okay, the lead that we have to tell is that our ministry is making a difference in people's lives. The people who you're sending your newsletter to that haven't yet engaged your virtual worship, they're going to be much more likely to when they hear one of their friends and colleagues talk about what difference it made in their life. Not the fact that you tell them again that you're doing it. It's that somebody that they know and love and care about is finding meaning in that. That's going to drive them to engage it. It's also going to drive your donors to want to make sure that you're well taken care of and supported in these times because you're making a difference in people's lives. Then I am also highly recommending that in these days that we're sending a once a month direct mail piece into people's homes. And it starts out with something like, hey, it's been a crazy time, but here are some of the things that God's been doing through our ministry. 4 bullet points, 4 little mini paragraphs of outcome story, concluding with, and we appreciate all the generosity that's continuing to this congregation. We've included an envelope for those of you that still like to write a check, because there are people out there that still like to write a check. My mother missed my birthday this year because of all this. I got a check in the mail yesterday. She has no other way to send me anything. So now I get to go to my credit union and risk getting the disease because she has to write a check, right? But that's how she's going to do it. And so we need to honor that and not force her to use the Cash App on my iPhone or anything, because she's not going there. So anyway, to do that mailing once a month, and I'm going to recommend right now, and life is changing quickly, but my recommendation right now is that letter continues for at least 2 months after we're back to meeting face-to-face again, because I'm not sure everybody's coming back immediately. And so we need to continue that messaging. Oh, and by the way, speaking of that, I just had an outcome story from, who was I talking to? The last synod I talked to. Anyway, Southeast Michigan. And somebody said they had one of their members who's unable to worship in public anyway because of some immune system issues, not fully homebound, but just not allowed to be in large groups. Before the lockdown orders came, called the pastor and said, would you meet me in the parking lot in 20 minutes? Pastor said, sure. Guy said, you know what? I wasn't able to give any money last year, and I'm sorry about that. Here's a check for $4,000. And he said, I'm kind of in the same position I've been, but I'm going to trust that God's still going to be here. And I'm going to trust that you've got some serious ministry to do as this virus hits and comes into being. What a beautiful generosity story from somebody that oftentimes congregations will forget about, who still had, I mentioned to this pastor, I said, this person still has wisdom and something else, some financial support to offer to this congregation. Just offered both. Tell that story. These stories are out there. So, all right, we've got to tell these stories of generosity first, foremost, over and over and over again. And I truly believe that by cultivating these stories, it's going to make the chaos of these days much more bearable for you. Because when all we do is the busyness, we can get really stuck in the busyness and we can get exhausted. When we spend our time thinking about and listening to and discerning what God's been up to in our places, we can be refreshed in the midst of the chaos, okay? So for your own health, cultivate these stories and then tell them. All right, so if I was a parish pastor today, the first thing I would do for stewardship, Please hear that part of it. It's not the first thing I might necessarily do. It's the first thing I would do for stewardship. I would call my top 10 donors, all right? And I'm not doing this to be elitist. I'm doing this because in most Protestant congregations today, the top 10 donors are giving somewhere between 20 and as much as 60% of the overall revenue of the congregation. When you contact and are present in their lives and you find out how it's going with them, you're going to get a good barometer for how things are going. And chances are, not only will the 10 still be with you, but some of them might even increase their giving. It gives you a nice, solid foundation to know where you stand. It's the quickest return on your investment. So this conversation doesn't look like, hey, it's Pastor Mike calling to see how you're going to be able to give this year, okay? It's a pastoral care call first and foremost. After you do the pastoral care piece, all you're doing is listening to discern the situation and let the situation lead to how the conversation might go. And it might go, hey, you're one of the most generous people to this congregation, and we really appreciate that. I'm calling to check in to see how how the situation in the world today might affect your giving, and leave it open-ended for them to share. If they've shared nothing but decline and problem, and they've shut their business down and things are bad, you've listened for that, right? And you should say something. You never say no for the person, but you may need to say something like, it sounds like things are going pretty poorly for you. Can you share with me what that might need to mean for your giving this year? You'll be surprised here. Some people will tell you, yeah, it's going really bad for me, but you know what? I put $20,000 in a donor advised fund last year, and that money's going to continue to come to you until we weather through this. Or they might say, you know what? I'm completely paying the salaries of my employees, so I don't have to lay anybody off. I'm probably going to need to cut back on my giving. But listen for that and celebrate that and give permission. I will tell you that anybody who cuts their giving to the church during these days is going to feel shame and guilt about that unless they're given permission not to feel that, okay? And it doesn't matter what situation led them to have to make the decision. People don't want to have to cut their giving to the church. They're going to feel bad about it. We need to be in a position where we can give people the gospel that it's okay, and we're going to walk together through it. I have encouraged several people during my career in times where they've had to cut giving, if they couldn't find a way to maybe be more generous during these times than they were before these times. That might mean giving less dollars, but maybe it means giving a larger percent. There's one person I know, I'm not going to give names or anything because I've not asked permission, who I gave permission to drop their giving, who had been giving 2% of their total income. She moved her giving to 4%. And when the economy came back and her income came back up, she continued to give 4%. So we need to make sure, I mean, that's a good long-term play from a fundraiser, right? But it's also the right thing to do for the donor. And we're doing our job right when we're doing the right thing for our donors. So then those same calls I had on my top 10, I'm going to do to my congregation council. I'm going to check in there as well. Here you may find a few more people that have been adversely affected and may need to have a conversation about what their giving is going to do. By the time you finish these two sets of phone calls, you're going to know pretty well how your congregation is going to continue to be able to do from a generosity perspective. And by the way, several of my clients had the best first quarter they've ever had. That included 3 weeks of not meeting face-to-face, okay? So I'm not sold that giving is going to be down this year. It doesn't have to be. Now we can lead people to decline their giving if we try, actually if we don't try very hard. But we can also lead people to significant generosity that we can even expand our ministries during this time. And I'm going to go ahead and just throw this in here now. Anybody that works with me is always told that they have to know what they would do if revenue accidentally exceeded expenses, okay? So if your revenue is going to exceed your expenses, and I think there's no better year to think about that than now. Because isn't it fun to think about what you might be able to do in times like this if you had more money? I think it is. I had another congregation, a non-member called the pastor and said, I know it's a tough time. I have some extra money to give. What do you want to do with it? And the pastor had the right answer. They said, I don't know yet. Can I come back to you when I do? And we'll invest that money in a way that really makes a difference. And the donor said, absolutely. I can't wait to hear what it is. Okay. Those people are out there, but they're not going to give you money if you don't need it. And they're not going to give it to you to add to your rainy day fund because, folks, it's raining, and those rainy day funds need to be deployed. All right, it's okay to do that. The reason if you happen to have any surplus, the reason you have that is so you can use it now. All right, to make a difference in the world. The goal isn't to see how much money we can save up during this time, for whatever's next. The goal is to start making a difference. So, anyway, I'm not going to do too much on automatic giving, except to say I have been pleasantly surprised to hear how many people are signing up for third-party apps like Tidely for automated giving. And you're going to get more of that after I'm done. So people are still willing to do that. I think it might not be a bad time to remind people they can do that through their own financial institution as well. But apparently our messaging about things like Tidely have been in the marketplace long enough that people are trusting it even in uncertain times, which again surprises me, but I'm delighted to be surprised. And so it's not a bad time to encourage that. But don't message it from the standpoint that your church needs their automated giving. If you had anybody sign up for automated giving in the last 3 weeks, get them to say why they chose to do it. And the story probably goes something like, I didn't want to have to worry about my giving during this time, and it makes me feel really good to know that it's going to happen automatically for the church. That's a far better message to encourage others to join in that than to say, hey, the church really needs your money now. People are going to respond better to the modeling of their neighbor than they're going to you begging for money, and especially the standalone message that says, hey, here's how you sign up for Tidely. No, people want to join others. We need to create a join us culture around anything we try to initiate, okay? So if you're trying to drive more people to automatic giving, have somebody say, hey, join me in doing this. Here's why I did it. Here's how you can do it, all right? The same is true. Somebody mentioned to me, would it be a good strategy to tell people they should tithe their government checks that are coming, the $1,200 or whatever that's coming out? And I said, I think that would be a terrible idea. I said, but I think it might be a fine idea for you to say, hey, I'm going to tithe my government check. Would anybody like to join me in doing that? Or, hey, the executive committee of council has all covenanted that we're going to tithe our government checks. Would you like to join us? Or, hey, everybody on the stewardship team has said we're going to do this. Would you like to join us in doing that with us? Don't point to people what they should do. Invite them to join you, invite them to join others, invite them to be part of a groundswell. You've heard of crowdsourcing before? It's kind of like that, but in a church with better responses, okay? Don't just tell people what they ought to do. Invite them to join you. So if you're not going to tithe your $1,200, no, you shouldn't put that message out there. But a join me or a join us message will come along well. That's the failure of most end of year letters too, by the way. I know it's not the end of the year, but when we send out the letter at the end of the year that says, hey, you ought to give some extra money to the church this year, most of the people hear that as, well, somebody else will do that, right? We need to create that join us, that join me culture. So we need to keep a sense of abundance in these times and not immediately run to scarcity. For some of you, that might mean you need to put in place a crisis communications strategy. You may not have one. At the least, I would probably say the only people communicating to our members right now are the pastor and the council president, okay? That if the treasurer needs to make a statement, that message needs to come through either the president or the pastor, okay? Because I've seen a couple of places where the treasurer has run, and if there's any treasurers on the call, I love y'all, but sometimes the messaging that means well comes across from a scarcity mindset instead of an abundance one, where immediately the thought is nobody's going to give anything else, right? Immediately goes into retreat. We need to make sure it's our message. We need to make sure we're putting out the right message. An immediate message that says we laid off the custodial staff because the building's not being used might actually make a few of your members a little upset. Like those of us who care about social justice and have not cut our giving yet, or hopefully ever, but why would we get rid of the people that we've cared about before who have done some great work for us before just because now all of a sudden, we made a change, or changes and plans happened. I think what a great time to do some deep cleaning on the facility. Don't lay off your youth director because the youth group isn't meeting. I'd rather somebody still be checking in with my kids. I mean, so we're not in a crisis until we're in a crisis. We don't need to sound, I mean, again, I have several clients who had the best March ever. These are churches. And so we're not necessarily in a crisis but you know what happens if we start cutting immediately? Our people are going to go right there. If my church all of a sudden starts cutting everything we do, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to move money to somebody that's going to do some good in the world. All right. And so we need to stake our claim that we've got something to offer in this time and offer it and make sure that we're not running to a place of scarcity. Your ship is not sinking yet. If your ship is sinking, just know your donors are going to only help you bail water one time. All right. So if your ship starts sinking, you can put out the plea that you need some extra help right now. But just know that's the only time you get to do that message during this crisis. All right. If your ship keeps sinking, eventually people are just going to let it go. All right. And so that's not the message. The message needs to be these generosity stories and getting stories of abundance out there. I will give a quick shameless plug. I wrote a book this year called Abundance. It's available by Fortress Press, and it's a bunch of strategies on how to create a culture of generosity instead of one of scarcity. That's enough for a sales pitch on my book. When you do your virtual worship, I hope you'll still have an offering time. I believe that giving an offering is an act of worship. By cutting it out of your virtual service, you're telling people it's not. Okay? So I encourage you to continue to have it. And I encourage you to use the time of that to tell people, hey, you can go to our website right now. You can write your check right now, or you can listen to me tell a story of generosity that I've seen this week. And what a great point in the service to give an outcome story or a generosity story for people to know that things are still, there's a lot of crappy stuff happening out there, but there's still some places where some really good stuff is happening. And I'm excited to be part of this ministry making that impact. I want you to know I mentioned it a little bit earlier, there's something called a donor advised fund in charitable giving in America. At the end of 2019, not too long ago, there was $120 billion in donor advised funds. A donor advised fund is where a donor moves money into this fund, and at that moment, it's a charitable gift. But that money doesn't go to a charity until the donor advises the fund as to where to send the money. It's 120 billion, that's a billion with a B, dollars in the United States at the end of 2019 in donor advised funds. There are many of us in philanthropy today that think donor advised funds are going to lead the surge into the next level of impact in philanthropy, okay? The way you would know that a member of your congregation has a donor advised fund is when you get their offering, it doesn't come from their personal account. It comes from Schwab Charitable, Fidelity, ELCA Foundation, In Faith Foundation, on their behalf, all right? So look in your records and see whose checks aren't coming from themselves, and let that be the person that becomes a good friend of yours. Because if they have a donor advised fund, chances are there's a decent amount of money sitting there that needs to be deployed to make an impact, all right? Feel free to help them deploy that money to make an impact. The CARES Act is a $2.2 trillion bill that was enacted by Congress and signed into law last week. It is being rolled out. The payroll protection piece of that is being rolled out tomorrow, from what I understand. There should be information on the Synod website. I know there's information on the elca.org website, information from Ton Cuniff, the ELCA attorney. I am not here to give you any input or advice on whether or not you're eligible or how to apply or anything like that. I'm staying in my lane. Here's what I'm going to say about the CARES Act and that money. I hope you get some, okay? But if you do get some, I hope it's not the first message people hear about generosity happening within your congregation, okay? How did I start this? By talking about outcome stories. I don't want the outcome story to be the government came in and is going to help us survive, okay? Because you know what that's going to do to giving? It's going to pull the plug on it, and people are going to say, great, I don't have to give you anything because the government's going to take care of my church now. Let's let the government cover the people who have to cut because they lost their jobs, okay? So if we let that be the first story of generosity that happens within our churches, we're going to kill generosity. So that's where I'm talking about the CARES Act. Let it be a supplement and put it in context of, and then let that be the reason why you can start dreaming about what happens with revenue that exceeds expenses, okay? Because that should give you the cushion for some revenue to exceed expenses. Unless, of course, you have to fund a preschool staff that isn't teaching anymore, and it really is being needed to deploy to make a difference. But thank goodness you paid people for another couple of months, right? Let's also remember we can do what's right during these times. So couple other quick things. Quarterly reminders. Many of you send reminders after the end of each physical quarter, which would be like today. Let's be careful how we do those. Let's make sure that those statements include outcome stories. Let's make sure those statements recognize that some people are going to be in a different situation today than when they filled out their statement of intent last October or November. Let's make sure that we give people a little wiggle room permission. Ozzy and Neil, I'll be happy to send you a template we've developed that you can share however would be an effective way to share that. And you can modify this as you wish. I dearly hope that if those quarterly statements have looked a lot like a financial transactional receipt, that today they look a little bit more personalized with a live signature in blue ink, with a little note that says thank you, with a little note that says I'm praying for you through these tough times, with a little note that says I know your situation is changing and you don't know anything about tomorrow. Read Matthew 6:34 and I'm praying for you. All of that would be great things to do. Sending an anonymous financial transaction gift receipt is going to make it look like you're not paying attention and they're just an envelope number that is part of an ATM system for you to keep cash flow coming. So please do that. And please, during these days, increase the ways in which you say thank you. That congregation that, I think I told you a story about a congregation that got a $10,000 gift through their PayPal account this Sunday from a donor that usually only gives $6,000 a year. Well, that's a person that should be phoned, okay? If somebody grows or doubles their giving from $20 in April to $40 in April, that's a person that deserves a phone call and a little bit of gratitude and a little bit of check-in. If somebody calls and says, I'd like to give you some extra money to your pastor's discretionary fund because I know there's going to be some people hurting, you should thank them for it then. And then when you deploy that money to make a difference in somebody's life, you should call that donor back and say, hey, I want to let you know the other side of the story. And you don't have to give away anything confidential, but you can certainly tell stories anonymously. Let's improve our thank you game. I think every pastor should have a list on their desk of every family in the congregation, and you should work your way through that list, not alphabetically, but in terms of start with people where you've got a story of generosity that deserves an immediate response. And if you don't have one of those, then you can start wherever you want in the list to just say, hey, I was picking up the phone today just to thank you for your gifts. Our ministry's strong today thanks to people like you, and just want to show my appreciation. How are you doing? And having that conversation. Last thing, we do have a program called Stewardship for All Seasons that we do in the Synod. Ozzy would be more than happy to spend his day talking to you about such things. He coordinates that for us. We're currently down in the Charleston, well, the whole coastal area, basically. We'll have an area in the Midlands, and if we need another area because of what's going on, I think we can probably work together to figure that out. So if you're interested in long-term stewardship growth, Stewardship for All Seasons is available, and we can give you names of other people across South Carolina that can talk about that. And we may have a second program emerging this year that I've not even told Ozzy about, because it's only been talked about with a couple of people and I'm still developing it, but we may have something else coming out there as well. So pay attention to him over the next months if you're interested in some longer term or even some shorter term, just this fall kind of stewardship activity to help make sure we shore up what's emerging now. But we've got a great time, right? I truly do believe that if we communicate better now and do just a few of the things I've talked about now, we will emerge the other side of this crisis far stronger than we entered it. We're having many people are recognizing the need that the church filled in their life that they had kind of forgotten about. And more people are recognizing that need. I think God's going to do a whole lot of really cool stuff through this situation. Don't get me wrong. I think part of the situation is going to be very painful. But I think on the other side of this, we have a church that is much more relevant, much stronger, much more having a strong place in people's lives. But what we do during this crisis is going to help set us up for where we come in at that time. I've got a little bit over the time I thought I would. Let's open it up to questions. You can put those in the chat box, or you can, I don't know, you can try the raise your hand feature, or you can just unmute yourself and talk over the person next to you, and we can figure it out from there. So however it works, let's go to open it up to you guys. And this will be we stare silently in an awkward silence if you don't talk. So.
Mike, just also to let everyone in the meeting know that we have a template out there which Neil sent out. It's the template which is the model for that outcome letter. So that model is out there.
Oh, good.
And check the e-news today.
Okay, good.
Mike, this is Herman.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful words, wonderful modeling. I just wanted you to know that this past Tuesday in my morning devotional, it was about 1 Corinthians 8, the Macedonia Christians giving out of their, with great generosity and joy in a time of severe affliction. And then I ended it by having Cindy write out our check to Ascension Lutheran Church. And I said, if you haven't done this, I encourage all of you to take a moment and sit down and write out your next check to your congregation. So modeling that this is something that we're doing. And that might be a resource that others could do, or some others could put that together. I'm writing out my check. And I told them, I said, I'm not writing out the check, because Cindy writes out our checks. You don't want to be on the picture, but I've got her hands writing out the check. So that's a very simple thing to do and a way of encouraging people. And that might be a very good template that they could use as well. Thanks for your positive message and your leadership.
Thank you, Bishop.
Michael, we have a question from Michael Price. If we don't have a list of top 10 donors, how do you suggest a pastor or leader ask for that information in a congregation?
So I may have to post actually, I'm happy to do that for South. Y'all have been I've got a video on this very issue. It's a video, though, not during the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, nothing changes with the exception of the urgency. Okay. And Doug, I've worked across South Carolina for a long time. I know that probably 60% of you are currently in positions where financial giving information is not shared. You're a little bit above average in that number too, by the way. And so it's a great question. I do have a chapter on that very topic in my book. Again, second shameless plug if anybody's keeping track at home. But it is a big issue. It's a sensitive issue, but at the same time, I believe what we're dealing with right now exacerbates the urgency of the leader of a congregation having access to this information. Because how can you lead an organization to health, stability, and seeing what God is calling to you next if you don't know where your money's going to be coming from? There's always this fear, well, maybe the pastor will begin to treat us differently if he or she knows what we give. Well, I hope your pastor will treat you differently when they know what you give. And we're being recorded, so everybody, you can't quote me out of context. But you better not treat anybody better than anybody else because you know what they give, okay? But yes, we do need to treat people differently. We need to know who can we go to. If we need to launch a new initiative, who can we go to for that seed money? If we need to know if we're going to lose 40% of our income, can't we talk to the donor that gives us 40% of our income to find out if we're going to be stable or not? If we have somebody who makes $1 million a year in cash salary and they're only given $38 a year to the congregation, can't we talk to them and be the voice of God in the conversation about where they are in their journey? And by the way, that's an almost true story. They do give a little bit more than $38, but I know somebody whose annual income is higher than $1 million who's giving less than $1,000 a year to the congregation. I want the pastor bringing the voice of God to the conversation and exploring that from a spiritual issue. If Jesus is right, and I just love to start Ozzy knows I love to start a sentence with that phrase. But if Jesus is right in Matthew 6:21, where he says, where your treasure is, your heart will be also, how can a pastor do their job if they don't know where their members' hearts are? And so it is a spiritual issue, and it's being exacerbated right now because your donors who step up and give you extra, they're not looking for accolades. They're not looking for their name to be published in the newsletter, but they want to know that you use the gift well. And many of them do want to know that they're appreciated. And there are also donors out there that if they're not appreciated or you don't let them know that their gift is making a difference, they're going to start to wonder if their gift is making a difference. And if they wonder long enough, you know what's going to happen to their gift? They're going to give it somewhere else where they do know the outcome to their gift and that their gift is making a difference. And so just to nurture our people along, we have to know. There is not, and I'm sure there are people on this call. I mean, I know that Bishop and Ozzy for certain know the Constitution better than I do, but there is nothing in the model ELCA Constitution that says the pastor shouldn't know what people give. So there is no constitutional basis to keep that information from the pastor. I believe you should here's how I would do it today. I would call the president and show him this section of this video because you're going to get a copy of the recording. Call your council president and say, I really need to have access to this information. We're not going to have a congregational vote on this. We're not going to have a council vote on this. I want you to just know that I'm going to have this information. I want you to bless it. Then we're going to tell the council what we did next time we meet and just tell them to deal with it. You can say it in a nicer way than that, but this doesn't need to be a democratic vote. This is the way that we can be effective leaders of congregations. I want you to name one college president who doesn't know their top 10 donors. I want you to name me one Lutheran institutional president who doesn't know their top 10 donors. I want you to name me the president of a food pantry in your community that doesn't know the names of their top 10 donors. They know them because they want to develop a relationship. They care about their organizations and they want to lead their organizations to be vital, vibrant communities. And I believe we're killing a church when we hold that information back. Ozzy's heard me talk about this before, but Ozzy's never heard me talk about with this level of passion about this topic because it is much more urgent in the situation we're living in today that we stop this, okay? Now, if you're going to treat people better because you know they're giving information, then shame on you. But I don't believe that's the case.
All right.
And I also don't believe that just because somebody else might have abused this 4 decades ago, that's any reason to continue to hold on to that today. So I'm a little more passionate about this than I once was.
Mike, it looks like we have a question from Tim.
Yeah, I was just getting ready to ask a question.
Okay.
You were talking about, we've been doing our live streaming and we do have a time for offering, but like a story about generosity. I mean, you think it'd be all right? I've been calling people since this all happened, and I've had like a half a dozen people without me even approaching the topic have talked about, okay, how do I sign up for automatic giving now? You know, and I just thought that that's really kind of unique. I haven't even brought up the subject, just checking in with people, seeing how they're doing during this time of quarantine and stuff. And they injected into the conversation. And I thought, would that be appropriate story to share during the time of offering?
I think that's a delightful story to share at the time of the offering. I think you'll enhance that story if you'll get a quote from one of them answering the question, why did you choose to do this now? So that you make sure you get their words of, I love my church, I care about my church, I don't want my church to have to worry about whether my giving gets there or not. That will, anytime we can use real life quotes from people, we enhance that storytelling. Without the quote, it's a fine story, and certainly worth sharing. You'll enhance that story by getting a quote from that person, and whether you can use their name or not doesn't necessarily matter. Always better if you can, but doesn't have to be.
All right. We have another question from Sandra. How is the Congregational Council involved in this process?
So that's a great question. I don't know that I want my council in general calling people, asking them about their giving. All right. During the stewardship drive, I don't mind a council calling and saying, hey, can we count on your pledge? but I'm not sure I want them necessarily checking in on giving. But I think it would be delightful for council members to be checking in on people to see how they're doing, and then asking them how they're engaging virtual worship and other opportunities the congregation's providing, and for the council to be prepped to listen for outcome stories. Because ultimately, where I like to go to this long term is where we create a culture of harnessing these outcome stories to be shared. I believe one of the main reasons Lutherans aren't known for their evangelism efforts is because we haven't given a great story to tell. You know, our story often is how much we are behind budget, right? Well, who's going to tell that story? You know, but let's how about it? The communication video I've got talks about this, and if you can get the council members seasoned and trained to listen for, man, God's up to something in their life. I need to get this written down and shared. That's the way I would engage the council, is the communication piece, not necessarily the asking piece. There could very well be a person or two on your council or otherwise in the congregation that can share this check-in kind of calls on giving. I mean, ultimately we'd like to get there, but you certainly don't want somebody who's awkward around this topic calling somebody and maybe doing damage around the area of giving. So.
Okay, I see no more questions at this point. Is there something else from, oh wait, Ozzy needs to speak here. Ozzy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, just to say that just last week, you're talking about quotes from people. We had a quote from a pastor in a congregation that has done Stewardship for all seasons in their second year. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but essentially it said, actually, our congregation is not worried about our financial situation at this time because we have been working on this for the last 2 years through Stewardship for all seasons. So we have few worries at this time about getting through this crisis.
Mike, anything else?
You know, the last thing for me is just to kind of reiterate, this is not the time for the church to turn in and just care about its own survival. This is the time for the church to be looking for what's God calling you to do. And that's in a number of ways. That's caring for the people in your community that may be hurting. It's also making sure we're caring for those Lutheran organizations that we know and love. Many of you all know I come from a camping background. I'm a little worried about what it means for a summer camp not to have summer camp, if that's where we end up. And I don't want to vision a future of a church that doesn't have faith formation happening at camp. I also don't want to look at a world that doesn't have Lutheran services I just blew their name, child and family services. I don't want to think about a church that doesn't have strong Lutheran college, strong seminary support. So let's make sure that in this time, we don't make sure that it's just us as a congregation that survives. Let's make sure we're looking at our neighbor, and let's make sure we're looking at those institutions that have been so important and valuable over time. I think it's a great time to adopt a camp or adopt a kid or adopt a college student or any of those. You know, I'm a camp guy at heart, so I go there first, but let's make sure we do that, and we all come through this together stronger. Yeah, I'm going to leave you with that, I guess.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen for just a second, because earlier, Mike, you brought up something that about the support from the government.
Yes.
Can you mention what that is while I pull this up?
So again, the CARES Act is the $2.2 trillion bill that was passed through Congress and signed into law. And there's a portion of that. There's two portions that you may very well be eligible. One is just a loan that would be a low interest loan that you could have. I never encourage debt when we don't need it. I encourage generosity first. But the other piece of it is the payroll protection part of that. That would be a forgivable loan and it's designed to keep people employed. It's designed to keep fewer people moving towards unemployment and more people employed. And forgivable loans, I'm all in favor of. If you're eligible, and you can go for that. So,
okay, so on the Synod website, under a coronavirus information page, if you go to our homepage, there's a picture right in the middle to click to get to this page. If you come to this page and click on Churchwide, it takes you down to the resources from Churchwide. The first 3 downloadable pieces have information that are useful right now. The third one here is a summary of the CARES Act provisions. And these are all PDFs that you can download information and read more about.
thanks, Neil. I just also saw a quick question there from Kathy on the diocesan appeal. If you go to my blog, there's a blog about capital campaigns in times like these. And Kathy, if you'll just insert the word diocesan appeal every time it says capital campaign, much of your answer would be there. I think everything I just shared that a congregation should do for communication, a diocese should do, or a synod should do. I think definitely people are relying on the synod pretty heavily right now and remembering, how important it is in our lives together. And so making sure those outcome stories are told of that appreciation, that sort of thing. So I think it's a good time for the diocese likely to be storytelling, and Kathy, I don't know your situation or anything, but if you need a workshop like this, I've been making myself available. I'm doing a Methodist version of this next week. So, that can happen as well. Feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me through that website there.
All right, Mike, if you would, send me an email later with whatever links you want to share, whatever information like that, and I'll get it in our next e-news.
Cool. That's great.
Okay.
Neil. I appreciate that. Yep.
Anything else for you today?
I'm good. Y'all can move to